welcome to the Introduction to Love or the Philosophy of Love tutorial and lecture series that I am currently teaching. My name is Julian. If this is your very first time joining these live stream tutorials, basically the idea is that every Monday morning from 8 to 9 a.m., nice and early, I sort of hang out with you guys and give you a 60-minute lecture, essentially introducing you to some of the key philosophical concepts and theories appertaining to the idea of love. Love and how to find it, love and its pain, love as a wound, and today, love as a disaster. That's going to be our topic for today. We're going to be having a little bit of a deep dive into Slavoj Žižek's theory of love. Now, if you are joining us for the very first time, I just want to say welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. We have a global learning community from people around the world. And so if you have a moment, I'd super appreciate it if you left a comment letting me know where you're joining us from. That makes me super, super, super happy. Like, honestly, this is not a lie. The thing that I find most enriching about being on the internet is this idea that I can connect with people from around the world. It's very old-fashioned, but it literally gives me butterflies in my stomach every single time. It is so surreal. So please do leave a comment letting me know where you're joining us from, and that way I can give a little shout out to you and your country, because that gives me so much joy. Now, I'm recording this on Instagram and YouTube simultaneously. Hello, YouTube. And today, for the very first time, we also have a fluffy microphone. We now have a ring light and a microphone, so it's becoming very professional. However, this microphone is not connected to Instagram. It is connected to an iPad because I will be uploading this audio to my Patreon. Basically, if you enjoy these tutorials and if you'd like to follow them week by week and listen to them as a podcast, I upload all of the audio, all of the edited transcripts, courtesy of my wonderful wife, Jeneline, to the Patreon. So basically, if you go to my Patreon, you're able to download all of these tutorials that I teach every Monday as a podcast. Plus, you can access all the tutorials I've taught in the past. Also, there's a bonus podcast that we record after every lecture, and that podcast is on our Substack and Patreon. All you have to do is click the link in bio, or you can go to www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. Now, that link is not on my front page, so I'm going to say it one more time because this is the only way to find that link. I know, not very good marketing. www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. That's my Patreon where you can download these classes. Now, today what we're going to do is we're going to do a deep dive into Slavoj Žižek's philosophy of love. And hopefully along the way, this will provide you with some intellectual nutrients by which to self-reflect on your experience of love. However, I want to be very clear that this is not advice. This is not a recommendation how to live. This is not a normative analysis. Instead, the goal is hopefully to analyze various different philosophical and psychoanalytic approaches to the universal idea of love in a manner that will hopefully be enriching for you. So that's my basic value proposition, if you will, that we're going to learn about philosophy, we're going to learn about psychoanalysis, we're going to have a little bit of fun along the way, and hopefully we're also going to be able to use that to self-reflect and perhaps even to improve as human beings, because ultimately I think that's the goal for me when I read philosophy, is that not only do I find it enriching and stimulating, I feel like it makes life a little bit less painful and perhaps a little bit more worth living. That's always been my attitude. So if you're going to join us for this tutorial, make yourself comfortable. Please do let us know what country you're joining us from in the comments. That would make me ever so happy. It really, really does. And I think we should just sort of launch right in right now. Okay, so Slavoj Žižek, the, maverick philosopher, noted contrarian and provocateur from Slovenia, has a fairly interesting theory of love. And as with most of Žižek's theories, you can essentially boil them down into three components. There is a Lacanian psychoanalytic component, there is a political dimension, which is also a critique of ideology, and then there's usually something related to Hegel. This is essentially the philosophical cake mix or pancake batter that Žižek concocts, where he uses psychoanalysis and he adds some philosophy, usually either transcendental idealism from Kant or speculative idealism from Hegel. No worries if you don't know what those terms mean, we'll get there. And then he sort of stirs it up into a rich political froth, a critique of ideology. And so I want to start with Žižek's definition of love. And then we can kind of like unpack it from there. So we're going to start with like the most, the most easy to understand part, and then we're going to sort of slowly make it more complex. Essentially, and this may surprise you, Žižek says that love is a catastrophe. He says that love is a total disaster. Now, when you hear that, you might think that Žižek is saying that love is a bad thing, and yet nothing could be less true. Žižek says that love is the catastrophe and the disaster that, in a sense, unlocks your true self, that makes life worth living. Now, this is the classic image, if you will, of Eros and Cupid shooting the arrow, and you're walking through your day to day, and suddenly it's like, you've been like shot right in the belly, and you pull it out, and it's Cupid's arrow. You've been wounded by love that seems to come out of the heavens. And this is something that I wish I could tell my younger self, is that my preoccupation used to be that I wanted to find love. In fact, that if a relationship ended and I was in pain, that I thought that a band-aid for that pain would be to simply find more of the same, to find someone else to love, and to somehow replicate what I had whilst forgetting that which I had lost. It's a totally normal idea, right? That's of course where this whole idea of rebounding comes from, is that in a sense, when you're in love and you lose that love, it hurts so much that you want to sort of inflict another kind of hurt upon yourself that will at least perhaps be a little bit more entertaining. It's like, if you've hurt me, then at least now I could be the one hurting myself. It's like you say you're taking back control of your pain. I think that's what often happens with rebounding. You're not trying to be healed, you're trying to take control of your own pain. And if I could go back to my younger self and essentially say, don't spend so much time looking for love, because love will find you. And love will find you at the exact moment that you probably didn't feel like you needed love in your life. It's one of the beautiful ironies and paradoxes of love, right? Is that you're usually ready for love, not when you're looking for someone to complete you, but when you found someone who accepts you. Which means that you're pretty happy going about your day. You have your routines, you have your grind. You're essentially more or less self-sufficient. You're not outwardly looking for it. You're not desperate, you're not needy. And that's exactly when love comes to find you, or at least I think it often does. The more you try to find it, the more you try to force it, the more likely you are to chase it away. And yet, when you're going about your day and you're just good by yourself, that's when all of a sudden you hear a hissing by your ear, and it's like Cupid's arrow has struck. And this is why Žižek says that love appears as a kind of disaster, because it completely shatters the equilibrium of your life as it had been before. And think about it, this is so true, right? Because when you're in love, suddenly the things that used to give you joy, that used to be perfectly fine, like enough, suddenly seem kind of hollow and empty. For example, you could be, having a meal or watching a movie, and in the back of your mind, you're thinking about that other person. You see a couple on TV, and you think to yourself, if only that were me. It's like you suddenly went from being pretty much okay to not being okay unless you're with that person. At this point, of course, you have an infatuation, you have a crush. We are not necessarily in the realm of love yet. Now, as I've said before in one of these classes, one of the differences between a crush and love is that a crush belongs to you. A crush is relatively safe. You don't have to act upon it. A crush is something that, in a sense, allows you to keep love at a distance, right? I'm convinced that this is why a lot of people, for example, crush on celebrities or fictional characters, or they put a poster on their wall, or their screensaver is like some, Korean boy band singer. Is because as long as you have this crush, you don't really have to act upon it. You don't really have to go out there and be wounded by love, or God forbid be, the person who wounds someone else. A crush in this sense is kind of like a safety blanket. You can go about your day whilst enjoying the idea of love without necessarily having to face the perils of love. Now, what that means is that love will disrupt the unity and the safety of your crush. Let's say that you're kind of crushing on I don't know why I keep going back to this, but like a Korean boy band. and you've got this person on your screensaver, and like you like looking at their face, and you fall asleep thinking about, you know, what if you went for a walk together and you held their hand or something? I don't know if I don't mean to be projecting. This is a crush. And then you're suddenly out and you get struck by Cupid's arrow, by Eros. And all of a sudden your crush is no longer enough. That's when you realize that a love destroys a crush. That suddenly your crush appears to you not only as a little bit juvenile, but as in a sense necessarily so. It's like training wheels for love. Like it taught you how to be intimate, how to prepare yourself mentally, psychologically for the adventure of love. Because of course love isn't safe. Love is a much more dangerous proposition. As Žižek says, love is a total disaster. And this is where Žižek often relies upon an idea from another theorist, literary critic, Terry Eagleton. And one of the interesting things about Terry Eagleton is that he's kind of like an unusual symbiosis of two strands of thought that you wouldn't usually expect to see together, or at least today you wouldn't. On the one hand, he's a religious person. He is essentially someone who's quite involved in theology. On the other hand, he is also a leftist literary theorist. And one of the things that Terry Eagleton has done, which I think is quite interesting, is that he basically defines love according to two categories. He says, on the one hand, you have love as eros, romantic love, potentially even sexual love. And then you have agape. Now, most people know that agape is the Christian Latin term for love, unconditional love, universal love. And yet this is where Terry Eagleton makes a crucial difference. He says, what if eros is romantic love? And what if agape is political love? Now, you hear that and you think, political love, what's that supposed to be? Because if there's one thing that politicians seem to be lacking, then it is certainly love, or at least outward demonstrations of affection. We live in a kind of reactionary political moment in which the easiest way to gain support from your audience or money from your followers is to collectively find a scapegoat or an enemy that you can invect against or that you can make people fearful of. Love doesn't necessarily come into play. And this is precisely what Terry Eagleton has in mind. He says that romantic love is something that you experience on the universal level. It disrupts you. Political love is something that disrupts the world. And now suddenly you see what Terry Eagleton is trying to do, and where he sort of reveals himself to be an old school Marxist. Because he's essentially equating agape, the idea of universal Christian love, to the idea of solidarity, which is the bridge towards the Marxist idea of revolution. But if that's true and we can dispute this, then vice versa, what happens within you when you fall in love, Eros, is also a kind of revolution, an inner revolution. And now you can understand why Žižek would use Terry Eagleton's binary distinction between Eros and agape, namely, in a sense, as personal revolution versus political revolution, as a particular revolution on behalf of yourself, and a universal revolution on behalf of the body politic. And he relates it to the idea that love is a disaster. Because as we all know, most revolutions are disasters, right? I think it's really important to go back to this idea that what makes a revolution isn't that one group is violently usurping another or fighting against another. Instead, the whole point of a revolution is the idea that suddenly the very incentive structures that seem to guide and animate the manner in which you structured your life have fundamentally changed. And this is why love, in that sense, is the ultimate inner revolution, because you were living a life in which the coordinates appeared clear to you. You were going through your day-to-day motions, and you knew what had to be done, and you knew what was right and what was wrong, and you knew how to govern yourself. And suddenly there's this inner revolution takes place by which up becomes down and down becomes up, and you're completely discombobulated, and you're living a kind of terrorizing, nebulous, interbellum state between who you once were and who you might become. It's like, I know this is a total misappropriation of the Gramsci quote, forgive me, but when Gramsci says that the old has died and the new has not yet been born, that is what it means to fall in love. The old you is now dead. Suddenly the incentive structures that used to animate and guide your life no longer seem to apply. And yet the new version of you, the person who's in a happy, healthy, loving relationship, has not yet been born. And so to be in this place, this kind of upside down, if you will, where you are stuck between the person you were once were, perfectly happy and blissfully going about your day-to-day, and the person you now wish to become, the person who becomes coupled with somebody else, that is what Žižek calls a disaster. This is why he, in a sense, says that love is a disaster. But it's a beautiful disaster. It's a kind of inner revolution. It's a particular experience that frames the universal experience of what a revolution, agape, unconditional love, might be. Now, we're going to break that apart a little bit more, right? But these are sort of some of the basics. This is why Žižek says that love is a disaster. Now, remember when I said that Žižek essentially uses like a kind of like, I don't know, cake mix or pancake mix to make this argument. We said that he uses Lacanian psychoanalysis, which is a radicalization of Freudian psychoanalysis, which is already pretty radical by itself. Hegelian idealism, which is a strain of philosophy that essentially, I'll explain this later, but it focuses on the idea of spirit. Žižek says that Hegel is in fact the greatest philosopher of love. Now, why would Hegel be the greatest philosopher of love? Well, essentially, Žižek says that Hegel uses love as a metaphor for the entire functioning of the universe as such. This is like Hegel on a metaphysical level, but we're going to get there in a moment. And then finally, Žižek makes a political argument, an ideological argument, if you will, or a critique of ideology. So let's start with the political angle. Let's then introduce the Lacanian part, and then let's end with Hegel. I also want to take a very quick break here to say that I'm so happy that you are joining us here. I love hosting these tutorials Monday morning. It's like, for me, the best way to start my week. My comment stream does not appear to be working on Instagram. So if you're letting me know where you're joining me from, I'm super, super grateful and happy, but I can't shout you out because I can't see the comments, unfortunately. And just a very quick plug, because there's no link to this on my front page on Instagram. But if you'd like to download the audio for this class, I'm currently recording it on this very cute little boom mic. Apologies for people listening. And I'm going to be posting this to my Patreon as a podcast. So if you'd like to download all of my live streams as a podcast, please do head over to www.patreon.com/Jenaline and Julian, which is Jenaline and Julian. Jenaline and Julian. www.patreon.com/Jenaline and Julian. I know I probably should have created an easier link, but I'm not good at marketing. So anyway, okay, we're about halfway through this discussion. What is Žižek's political take on love? Now, as you recall from the beginning of this live stream, Žižek has already suggested that love is a disaster, that love is a kind of inner revolution, if you will. And this is also why Žižek says that perhaps the strongest opposing force to love today, and this is probably going to surprise you, the strongest opposing force to love today is in fact the idea of philanthropy and charity. Now, why is that? Why would philanthropy be the opposite of love for Žižek? Well, if you think about it, what does philanthropy do? Philanthropy essentially raises money for good causes. Essentially, it tries to elevate the plight of other people by means of monetary incentives or solutions or investments. And Žižek says that the fundamental principle of philanthropy, even apart from the tax incentives behind it, is to say, I want your problems to not be my problems, right? There's something within philanthropy that the problems of somebody else, they become in a sort of like safely stowed away in a non-confrontational place. Plus, you have the surplus enjoyment, which is a Lacanian term, of now considering yourself a good person. For example, there's no surprise that the biggest venture capitalists in the world are also the biggest philanthropists. It's like they spend half their day creating the very conditions and fueling the fires of global financial inequality, and then they spend the rest of their day sort of putting a Band-Aid on it so that at least they can sleep at the end of the day. But this is just true for people who are investors or, I don't know, billionaires. It also works on the individual level, and it's not your fault. This is precisely how the consumer society is structured. Think about it. You go to buy a cup of coffee, and it says a small portion of your coffee purchase will go to funding or fighting poverty in Africa. You go and you fly on a plane, and it says a small amount of your purchase for this ticket will go into planting trees and creating a forest, etc. There's all these ways in which we're perpetually doing something that we know is contributing to a global problem, and yet we sort of assuage our consciousnesses precisely by saying, well, at least a part of my consumptive practice is going into a good thing. There's a selfless component to my consumption. And this is also why perhaps the most capitalist mode of consumption today is precisely ethical consumption. Because ethical consumption doesn't just sell you a product, it sells you the dream of a better world, and most importantly, a dream of a better you. Something that Schopenhauer already knew. Schopenhauer said that the easiest way to sell something to somebody is to simply sell them themselves. Because the thing is, like, you could sell somebody a car, but what if you sold somebody a dream of a you who's more adventurous? Which one are they going to buy? It's the latter. And so people are sold the idea of a better world to which they have contributed. Now, I want to be clear, this is not supposed to be a cynical take. Obviously, it's better for a percentage of your, purchases to go towards fighting poverty or towards saving the planet. It is better than nothing. This is not a kind of defeatism. Instead, what Žižek is trying to do is he's trying to point out that if love is a disaster, right? If a private romance, Eros, is a kind of inner turmoil, an inner revolution or disaster, then vice versa, the way in which love is sold to you in public is as the opposite of disaster. Love this hamburger and you will save the world. Love this iPod and you will contribute to saving the world. Love your life like you love yourself and love your travels and you will contribute to saving the world. And so we have this weird mirroring effect that happens, which is that love appears to us as a kind of private revolution where nothing is the same. And yet, when we're engaging in the consumptive practices that are framed as loving yourself and loving your life as an ethical consumer within capitalism, we're actually engaging with the world as staving off disaster and, in a sense, not having to face the painful truth of what is coming. And so Žižek relates this idea essentially to what the French existentialists called mauvaise foi. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I apologize to all the French people listening. But mauvaise foi is essentially false consciousness. And false consciousness, oops, my ring light's like almost about to fall. False consciousness for the French existentialists was simply that you were living in a manner that wasn't befitting to the reasons why you were living it. Think about it, like so often, and this could even be true for procrastination, right? Procrastination for me is like the ultimate case of mauvaise foi, which is you're not even doing nothing. You're just doing little some things that collectively amount to nothing. Nobody procrastinates because they've chosen to procrastinate. Procrastination is a kind of liminal state in which you are stuck between what you were doing and what you would like to do. In this sense, like procrastination is like the horrible inverse of having a crush. It's like, when you pick the romantic motif of picking the petals off the flower. Does he love me? Does she love me? Does she not love me? She loves me. She doesn't love me. That's procrastination for love, right? It's a kind of like fixation and obsession that allows you to comfortably stay in that interregnum where you haven't actually asked them, do you love me? You haven't actually forced the situation, because everybody knows that the scariest thing to do is to actually test your love or confront the other person, because what if they don't love you? Suddenly, like, it's over. And at least when you're pining over the other person, there's that anticipation and potential. Procrastination functions in exactly the same way. When you're procrastinating, you're saying, well, I will get to the thing. But secretly, I think everybody fears this, is that when you try doing something well, you try doing something new, what you're afraid of is that you might fail, right? For example, I could dream of being, a great musician. And yet, if I were to try becoming a great musician, I might find out that I actually suck at music. And so often when we don't begin, when we procrastinate, it's because we're secretly afraid that we will fail at the thing we do, right? And so procrastination allows us to keep fantasizing and keep dreaming, but we're stuck. We're kind of in an inanimate, liminal state in which we're neither doing what we were doing before, nor we're essentially committing to what comes next. And this idea of procrastination, which is in a sense like loving the absence of the thing, is symptomatic for what we're all doing within capitalism in general. Mauvaise foi. It's saying we're engaging with the world, and yet we know that the things that we do, driving a car, traveling, perhaps even having children, although I'm not against having children, right? But there's always an ethical consideration about climate change. That to be a person in society also demands that you contribute to the slow eradication of the planet, and more importantly, perhaps, or just as importantly, that you contribute towards the very causes that sustain global inequality and that cause suffering to millions of people around the world. Of course, when you look at it that way, you could fall into a nihilistic trap in which you feel like you can't do anything anymore because everything is corrupted and ruined, and you end up sort of like falling into this despair, which is relatable and understandable, I think. And yet, the point here that Žižek is trying to make is that mauvaise foi isn't like what the French existentialist said. Mauvaise foi, false consciousness, isn't saying we're all doing this because we don't know any better. Instead, Žižek essentially inverts the Marxist take. Because remember, the French existentialists, when they talked about false consciousness, were simply taking an idea from Marx, except they didn't want to credit it to Marx because being a Marxist was no longer very cool. Understandably, considering what had happened in the Soviet Union. And so, the idea that Marx has is for they know not what they do. False consciousness is that you don't know how the commodity fetish is influencing you. And yet, Marx already realized that even if you were to quote-unquote see through the commodity fetish, if you were to see through the system that perpetuates inequality, it wouldn't change. The system doesn't care whether you can see through it. And this is exactly Žižek's point. What allows late-stage capitalism and a consumer society to function, selling us the idea of love and the idea of self-fulfillment as something that can be purchased, whether it's through clothes or holidays or experiences or cars or NFTs or whatever. What that precludes is that we do know better. One of the painful things about being a subject within the consumer society that we live in is that we all know better, and yet we do it anyway. And Žižek says that it's no longer for they know not what they do. It's everybody knows precisely what they are doing, and yet they still continue to do it. Which means that we all create this kind of inner hole in ourselves, which is we know that we're living our best life, we're trying to survive, we're trying to keep our head above water, and yet there's a nagging awareness because we're all more well-informed than we ever have been before that everything is on a kind of ticking clock, on a timer, that this way of living is not sustainable. And so it's precisely to paper over that gap that we are sold the idea of finding love. Whether it's da-da-da-da-da, I'm loving it, McDonald's, or whether it's the idea of romantic love in Hollywood, whether it's going on a trip and finding your true self and a loving partner in another continent. There's so many different ways in which the idea of love is put back on us as the ultimate fulfillment of our dream. And then when we realize that contributing to chasing that dream creates inequality in the world, we're told, well, a percentage of your purchase, of your coffee, of your flight, will go towards fighting poverty. It will make the world a better place. And so Žižek essentially posits that philanthropy is the ideological umbrella by which you can not only assuage your own consciousness, and you can say, I'm a good person because at least my consumption is ethical consumption, but that it actually creates what Marx already called alienation, and that we're more and more alienated not only from ourselves, but from each other. And alienation is, of course, the exact opposite of what love is. Alienation is the slow feeling and sense of detachment from the rest of the world. And so what happens within our society is that we become more and more alienated precisely because we all think that we're chasing love, we're chasing affection, we're chasing self-fulfillment. And it's precisely this that allows us to not undergo the private disaster, which is love. So far, so convoluted, but I hope that we're like slowly putting the pieces in place here. Now, this is where Žižek essentially takes the political argument, the critique of ideology, if you will, because, and let me give you a very quick definition of ideology, right? Ideology is simply, and maybe not so simply, but ideology, and if you're looking for a definition, it's important, because in school you learn that ideology is political ideology, or like, I don't know, manipulating force that's trying to make you think a certain way. And of course, within political science, that is how we think of ideology. You can have one political ideology that fights against another political ideology, this is the idea. And yet for Žižek, and this is not just Žižek, he draws upon, for example, the work of Althusser, who also had a critique of ideology as interpolation, but that's for another time. Ideology, and here comes the definition, ideology is simply what gives structure and meaning to our desires. Now, what that means is that when you live in the world as a subject, as a person, consumer society, late-stage capitalism, there are many things to want, and there are many things to do, and it can feel overwhelming sometimes what you should be wanting and what you should be doing. Should I go to college? Should I start an online business? Should I become a lawyer? Should I become an artist? Should I be going to this movie? Should I be going to this concert? And this whole aesthetic and lifestyle becomes predicated on a million little choices about what you wear and what you say and what music you listen to and what accounts you follow on the internet, etc. Like the curation of the self becomes a project of curation of the world. And essentially what happens there is that all of these little things that you desire have to be given some overarching meaning. And Žižek says that ideology is simply the framework that infuses your world with purpose and meaning. Essentially, when all those self-help coaches talk about what is your why is structured by ideology. In other words, Žižek essentially uses a Lacanian formula. If desire is what structures the subject, then ideology is what structures desire. And this doesn't have to be a bad thing, right? Žižek says that the most ideological thing anyone could ever promise you is precisely that you could escape ideology, that you could step outside of ideology, that you could take the right pill and you could be in a non-ideological space. This promise of living outside of ideology is itself ideological. And so for Žižek, perhaps the only way to escape ideology, if you will, isn't to embrace it. It's not to become a nihilist who says everything is ideology. Instead, it's to critique ideology, right? To be like a surfer who rides the waves of ideology, always one step ahead and yet flowing on the tide. When it all comes breaking down, you are the one who is still riding it. The critique of ideology is a way of living within ideology, I believe. Now, Žižek uses a Lacanian formula, as I just said. So let's look a little bit at what Lacan's theory of ideology entails. Not ideology, what Lacan's theory of love entails. So Lacan, the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, who is the spiritual successor of Sigmund Freud, has what I think is a very relatable idea about love. He says that love, when it happens to you, Eros, when you are struck by Cupid's arrow, this is not going to sound good on the transcript, but that is the sound of an arrow hitting my stomach. When you are hit by love, like a lightning bolt, that love turns you into a hysteric. Now, I want to very briefly say that the manner in which, within psychoanalysis, hysteria is used is quite different from the pejorative manner in which the idea of hysteria has been historically used to marginalize women's very legitimate grievances against being excluded from practically all of civic society. And so if a woman was expected to be at home mending clothes and reading or working all day, and she resisted this, she was often described as being hysterical. It's a very dark and depressing history of the word of hysteria and how it was weaponized against very legitimate female arguments about the patriarchy. And yet, within psychoanalysis, hysteria is boiled down to a simple formula, which is hysteria is, I don't know what I am to you, right? This means that like you could be in a hysterical relationship to God. This is also why like Kant, Immanuel Kant was in a sense a philosophical hysteric. Because Kant defines morality as, I don't know what God wants from me. I don't know what I am to God. Am I one of the chosen ones who gets to go to heaven, or am I one of the damned ones who is going to hell? And so Immanuel Kant says that, well, you have to spend your entire life living as if you knew what God wanted from you. That is what morality is. Morality isn't knowing what God wants. It's not knowing who am I to God. Morality is saying, I have no clue what God wants from me, and I'm going to act as if I knew. And of course, acting as if you knew creates ethics, which is the interconnection of how other people who don't know how to act interact. It's a little philosophical aside. So that would be a kind of theological hysteria. Not does God exist, because you would essentially presume you have faith in the existence of God if you are that kind of a religious person. And the hysteria would be, I'm not doubting that you exist, but I don't know what I am to you. The same thing happens when you're in love. When you're in love, you don't doubt that the person you're in love with exists. I mean, obviously, otherwise you wouldn't be in love. For those in the comments, by the way, this is being recorded and this is going into a book. You can find all that on my Patreon. Little plug, www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. I'll post it to my stories later. When you're in love, the same thing applies. When you're in love, you know the person you're in love with. It's not a crush. It's not a fixation. It's not like an illusionary thing. It's like you have like literal proof of the person you're in love with. They're a living, breathing human being, presumably. And yet, the question isn't, are they real? The question is, what am I to them? That's like, everybody who's been in love has had this experience. It's so agonizing. It's like you have fallen in love with somebody, and yet you don't know, do they love me back? Do they also love me? Like, because again, if you force it, if you say something like, hello, I love you, and I hope you love me, and let's be best friends and lovers for the rest of our life, there's no seduction. There's no tension. It's just like a guessing game, yes or no. And so you're stuck in this anxious position of having to guess what you are to them. And that guessing is what Lacan calls hysteria. It's saying, what am I to you? And I'm going to tell you that, unfortunately, this can perpetuate even when you are in a relationship. Lacan says that the most dangerous question in any relationship is, do you really love me? Because think about it. You could be in love and you're doing everything that lovers do. You wake up together, you have meals together, you go for walks together, you see your friends together. You're just having this great relationship. And yet, right before you go to bed, you wonder to yourself, is this it? Is this what love looks like? Is this what I've been waiting for? Do they really love me? Or perhaps even an underlying nagging question, which is often repressed, do I really love them? Because it's so difficult to qualify love. And the problem is that because we can't qualify love, we're tempted to quantify it. In other words, we turn love into a test. Now our partner has to prove their love to us through actions or things. It's like you've created this invisible, impossible barrier that they're somehow supposed to cross or leap over just so that you can prove to yourself that you are indeed worthy of their love, right? This is why self-love is so important, because if you don't love yourself in a relationship, not only are you going to doubt whether or not they love you, whether or not you are worthy of their love, like how would this amazing, beautiful person love someone as dumb and stupid as me? But specifically when you're in love, it's saying, I don't know exactly what our love means. There's a hysterical dimension within love, which is, what do we mean to each other? Like, think about it. Two strangers meet, and like, you're no longer strangers. You're the exact opposite of strangers. Like, you know their private parts better than anybody else. And yet, if you think about it, like a month ago, 2 months ago, 3 years ago, you didn't know each other. You were complete strangers. And one of the most painful things is when you break up and suddenly you have to go back to being strangers, and yet you can't really. How can you be strangers with somebody who you know so intimately? It's something that you have to train yourself into. It's very painful. It's like a completely alienating and sort of discombobulating experience. I think from personal experience, one of the hardest things I think you can go through isn't to love someone who doesn't love you back. That's painful. It's when somebody who you once loved will no longer allow you to love them. It's over. You have to pretend like you had something and it was great, but you will never had what you once had. It's very painful because it means that you have to change. If love changes you, then losing love means that you have to change yourself. It's not an easy thing to do. For example, the books that you had on your shelf, do they belong to her? Do they belong to you? Etc. Right? You have to reorganize and reframe your life. And so the psychoanalyst Lacan says that the most dangerous question you can ask in a relationship is, do you love me? It's the ultimate hysterical question. What do I mean to you? Now, the reason he says it's dangerous is because even if that person then says, yes, I love you, you're not inclined to believe them. Like, then you just think, well, maybe they just said I love you because I've asked. It's like, even if you succeed, if you get the thing that you think you want, you still end up like losing, right? you said, do you love me? And they say, yes, I love you. But now I'm even more suspicious because I'm like, well, did you just say that because I asked you? And so it's a trap. It's a trap, which is a hysterical trap of what are you to me? Instead, love functions analogous to what I described with Kantian morality. Remember, with Kant, there was this idea, I don't know what I am to God. So I will act in accordance with what I believe God would want from me. When you're in a relationship, it's not I will act in accordance with what you want from me. It's not I worship you. That would be totally fundamentally unhealthy. Instead, it's saying, I don't know what our love is. I don't know what love means to us. And so I will act as if I knew what our love demanded from us, and thereby I will find love. In other words, love is an act of faith. And what does faith require? Faith requires trust. And so by the daily repetition of acts that build trust together, you find faith, not in each other, but you find faith in love itself. And so love, as I said last week, is retroactive causality. Love comes through the back door. And I think this is something that people often don't realize is that, like, they worry that loving each other or not loving each other is everything. But here's like a very terrible dark secret. You probably already know already. Love is not always enough. You could love each other deeply and not make it work. In fact, the fact that you love each other could sometimes lead to a breakup. This is the whole idea that love is a disaster. It's a disaster that you have to turn into a salvation. And you're lucky if you can use it as salvation. You can enrich each other and teach each other and become better people together and find friends and hope and fulfillment and joy together. But fundamentally, love can't be quantified. It can only be qualified. Love is not a competition. Love is repetition. It means that you have to do the same things over and over again with the other person to build that trust. And here's the very simple reason why a breakup is so devastating is because it can take years to build up trust, and yet it's gone in an instant. And I made a video about this a couple of days ago where I said that what happens in a breakup is that they often try to frame it as a mistake. But it's not a mistake, it's a choice. It's a choice not to decide. When you're faced with temptation, a moment of madness, if you will, when you don't decide to fight for your love, you have chosen indecision. And then you frame that indecision as a mistake. And this is how a lot of cheaters try to get away with cheating, is they say, I made a mistake. It was a moment of madness. It meant nothing. And of course, it means everything. Because once you've sown the seeds of deceit, once you've undermined the trust, you've undermined the very foundation of what love is, because now you have to start quantifying love. Well, I don't trust you anymore, but here are the things I love about you. And that's not how love works. Love crumbles. It's a house of cards. And so what I'm trying to point out here is that it's precisely because you cannot quantify love that you have to qualify it. And the hysterical idea of what is our love and do you really love me is thereby precisely how you undermine love, because you force it into a relationship where you start quantifying it. And love can't be quantified in the same manner that trust can't be quantified. Trust isn't something that you can simply, do or give someone. It's something you have to build up over time. And so Žižek uses the idea, to go back to Slavoj Žižek, the idea of Lacanian love, which is essentially the idea that you have a kind of shared trust, a shared faith. And he says that if the question, do you really love me, is the most dangerous question in love, then it actually means that, for example, if you are really in love with someone, that you spend less time questioning what that love means, and you spend a lot more time filling in what that love could be. Whether it's, this is personal, whether it's waking up in the morning and thinking, everything I'm going to do today seems a little bit better because you're here. Whether it's being by yourself and finding yourself thinking about how the other person is feeling. Whether it is simply sitting with your loved one and saying, I am not going to fix you. I'm going to sit with you until it gets better, until it passes. There's a great motivational quote. I'm a little bit embarrassed to say this, but there's a great motivational quote that I saw recently, which is, we are not all in the same boat, but we are all in the same storm. And for me, that's what a relationship is. It's saying, I'm not you. I don't have the exact same dreams and ambitions or flaws that you have. Hopefully we complement each other. but we're in the same storm. And so we may not be in the same boat, but I will be with you. And this is the funny thing, right? It's a lot of people think that relationships are being in the same boat. You're just constantly together, you're kind of stuck. And yet for me, nothing could be less true. It's not that you're in the same boat, it's that you're in the same storm. And you may be rowing together or sailing together or whatever, but you are there for the other person when they need you most. Hence also why love, not to sound too soppy here, but love is marrying your best friend. Not we were friends and now we are in love and we get married, which is fine and great if that happens to you, but it is finding friendship within love that counts. Because look at it like this. What is the opposite of hysteria? It's friendship, right? If hysteria is, what am I to you? Friends would never say, what am I to you? The whole point of friendship is that you can't put your finger on it. You can't exactly quantify it. This is like where I'm very un-Aristotelian. Friendship isn't about what can you do for me. Friendship is precisely saying, I don't need anything from you. I like being with you outside of the incentive structure of mutual benefits. And so once you realize that friendship is simply the absence of hysteria, I never worry what I am to you or what you are to me. We just are. You realize why you have to find friendship within love. Because love will make you continually ask the question, what does our love mean? What am I to you? And when you fill in that gap, that hysterical gap, you fill it in through friendship. And so this is what Brecht, as I mentioned before, calls the third thing. Love is not enough. Love is a good starting point. But the third thing is friendship. How you find friendship within love. Okay, so essentially the components that we put together here in the last 45 minutes, and thank you guys for following this so far, is Slavoj Žižek says that love is a disaster, by which he means a private revolution. It discombobulates your daily experience. Secondly, we introduced his critique of ideology and of late-stage capitalism and a consumer society in which, for example, through philanthropy, we're trying to, in a sense, feel like we are better people and making the world a better place, and yet we are safe. We don't have to undergo the kind of inner turmoil of an inner personal revolution. That'll make sense if you go back and watch the whole thing. And then we talked about the Lacanian idea that the most dangerous question you can ask in a relationship is, do you really love me? The hysteria of love, and how you can fill in or plug the gap of the hysteric with, I don't know, the plug of friendship, if you will. It's not very eloquent. Poor rhetoric, sorry. And so I want to end here with why Žižek says that Hegel, the German idealist Hegel, is in fact the philosopher of love, the predominant philosopher of love. Now, you need no previous understanding of Hegel, because Hegel is a notoriously difficult thinker, right? That's something that I think we can all agree upon. But the reason that Žižek says that Hegel is the ultimate philosopher of love is that Hegel uses love as a metaphor for a metaphysical argument. Now, here's how that works. If love is the process by which I, as a individual, finite, mortal subject, in philosophical terms, as a particular person, have access to the universal condition of what it means to be alive, the universal connection of humanity, the thing that ties us all together, which is love, then you end up in a situation where I, my particular true self, finds my quote-unquote true self, my happy self, through love. In other words, on a metaphysical level, you have me, the particular subject, versus the universal of love. And this is the classic metaphysical divide going all the way back to Plato, the relationship between the universal, or truth, and the particular, which is appearance. In other words, the material world of the object, me as object, as flesh and blood, sack, versus the ideal, the pure form, truth, the universal, love. And there's this paradox that takes place, which is, of course, a fruitful paradox. Namely that if I exist without love, if you exist without love, even if you're happy, you're not tapped into one of the most important experiences of what it means to be alive. In a sense, there's this paradox by which when you become subject to love, when love hits you, when you go through the disaster of loving and being loved and of falling in love, you somehow feel like you've tapped into a universal substance of what it means to be alive. In other words, you are, to put this in like Rancière's terms, you are a singular universal. You are a universal unto yourself. And now we realize why it's a paradox, because it becomes a chicken and the egg argument. What came first? The universal of love? Or this mortal, fleshy body, the particular of subjectivity? Which came first? Was there love, and then we were there to find it? Or was there us, and love was made manifest in us? And now it's super important to emphasize that Hegel is a Christian thinker, except not in the way you might expect. Not, oh, universal love, we have to love everybody, the collective, etc. Right? In fact, this is something that both Hegel and Žižek have in common, which is that they say that universal love is precisely the opposite of love. You can't love everybody. If you love everybody, it means you don't love anybody. Like, it's good to treat people in a loving manner, but at the same time, like, love is individualistic, almost painfully so. Like, when you're in love, you want that person. And of course, you don't want to be controlling. You don't want to lock them up. They should have friends and a job and a career and be happy and individual and whatever. But there's a selfish component to love. If your best friend loves the same person you love, that is a threat to your friendship. Love doesn't say we can all love each other equally. There is an unequal part of love. It's why Plato said that love turns you into a crazy person. All the vices come into being through love. Not just jealousy, but gluttony, right? Think about sitting at home eating cereal, obsessing about your love. And so, Hegel's idea, his metaphor of love, is that it's a metaphysical argument as well. If love stands for the universal, and the human body stands for the particular, then how do they relate? Well, for Hegel, this is no surprise for you, it is dialectical. For those of you who haven't heard the word dialectical, here's a super quick introduction. Plato had this idea, which he called essentially the dialect, where two people exchange ideas, viewpoints. It's a discussion. And those ideas bounce around back and forth. And hopefully, by the end of that discussion, two competing viewpoints have reached a higher conclusion, essentially a debate, in which two people have reached a more wise conclusion, having gone through the pros and cons. That's Plato's idea about the dialectic. Hegel radicalizes this completely. Hegel says, what if it's not about a debate in which you reach a higher viewpoint? What if the dialectic is a kind of figuration or metaphor for the entire unfolding of the universe as such? Namely, the two things that are in debate with each other aren't two people with opposing viewpoints. What if on one side is the universal and on the other side the particular? What if on one side is truth and the other one is the world of appearance? Object, the world of illusion, versus the world of truth. And what if these are constantly gyrating around each other, and through their mutual incompleteness, we reach a higher form, a spirit? That is essentially Hegel using the Christian idea of agape as universal love and plugging it into the metaphysical edifice of Plato, in which we have the idea of exiting the cave and entering the world of truth. Hegel essentially posits, through Kant, but that's for another class, that you don't exit the cave into the world of truth. Instead, the world of truth illuminates the cave. That's a New Testament argument, if you will, right? It's not, oh, you have to enter into heaven to be with God and to become like God. It's, no. God is amongst you when you love each other. That's how Hegel takes a Christian argument and links it to metaphysics. And if you think about it, this is true for love as well. This is why love is a metaphor for Hegel. Namely, love isn't supposed to complete you. It's not, oh, love is the truth outside of the cave, and if I learn to let go of all the world of appearances, I can enter into the blissful existence of universal love. No. Love comes into me. Love, in a sense, enters into you, and it disrupts you. It's like that Kafka quote, love is a knife that I twist within myself. And this discombobulating experience is not only how love actualizes itself, but dialectically, how I actualize me. In this impossible unity between me as particular subject accessing the universal, which can only be made manifest through its fall into subjective, particular, finite selfhood. we find the dialectic. So Hegel's idea of the dialectic is essentially an interesting combination of a Christian argument about agape's universal love, combined with a metaphysical argument about Plato's allegory of the cave. There is no world of truth outside the cave, and you have to reject the cave. Instead, truth is only made manifest within appearance itself. And now we have essentially Žižek, Lacan, Hegel, and Plato, which is truth isn't the thing that's going to complete you. In the same way that love isn't the thing that's going to complete you. You can't step outside of ideology in the same way that you can't step outside of love. You were the product of love. You are the product of love. That is how you were born. From the moment that you existed on this earth, you were loved. And you will continue to love and find love. And so love isn't this thing that's like a goal that you have to find, or you have to exit the cave to be in like spiritual bliss of love. No. Love will come to you, and it will disrupt you. And love will actualize itself through you, which is how you actualize yourself in the world. And so love is a metaphor for a metaphysical argument about the interrelationship, which for Hegel is dialectical, between the universal substance, truth, love, agape, and individual particular objective reality, which is precisely the world of appearance. And that the world of appearance and the world of truth are not separated, but that they enable each other, that they actualize each other. And this is a revolution in the most literal sense of the word. It revolves. The dialectic is a revolution in which a gyrating motion of the universal and the particular creates the very thing which it thought it was lacking before. That's very technical, but remember, we're going to stagger this tutorial in waves. And so I want to end by going back to Žižek's idea, building upon Terry Eagleton, that Eros is romantic love and agape is political love. Because when Žižek says political love, he's also saying universal love. Universal love is code for communism. Not we love everybody, but specifically the idea that the emancipation of one predicates the emancipation of all. And that works within a relationship as well. You're only in a happy relationship if the conditions for your own success become the conditions of the success for the other. What happens within a happy relationship mirrors what ought to occur within a happy society. It's not just about competition. It's about your pursuits, and your success mutually enriches and benefits the success of everybody else. There's no such thing as winning an argument when you're in love. You will always lose. In the same way that your successes in love should enrich and benefit the other. And what Žižek does, because Žižek is an open, out-and-out communist, right? Old school communist, he's essentially making that argument. He's saying if agape isn't just unconditional love, isn't just universal Christian love, agape is also how the universal is made manifest through the particular, which is code. This is like the big reveal, is code for Marxism, essentially. Remember, Terry Eagleton is a Christian Marxist, which is an unusual combination. After all, Marx said that religion was the opium of the people. And so the argument, essentially, is that revolution, which for Marx is how the truth of the universal is made manifest through the excluded particular. We can do that in another class. Namely, every universal has an internal limit, which seems to be outside of it and yet contains its truth. For capitalism, that is the working class. The working class contains the truth of the inequality of capitalism. Now, once the working class realizes this, the working class realizes that it doesn't just have to rise up or fight against capitalism, but that it is the very breaking point within capitalism itself. That the working class is the only class that doesn't identify as a class. Once the working class realizes that a class, it ceases to be a class. There's no innate identity to it. We can do all this in another class, but this is like, I'm trying to reveal what Žižek's agenda is here. And so essentially, if the Marxist idea of revolution, which is the particular that contains within itself the universal, namely the working class, the particular that contains within itself the universal, which is the negation of the universal of capitalism as its own inner limit. Very technical. The same is true when it comes to love, when it comes to Hegelian metaphysics, that the universal doesn't exist to begin with, but is made manifest through the fall into a kind of failed particular subjective self, which of course is precisely what happens when you're in love. When you're in love, it's not that you've reached the ultimate nirvana of the universal of love, it's that love is made manifest through you. Love is an inner revolution. Love is a disaster, through which the truth of your being is revealed back to you, namely the impossibility of sustaining the false consciousness of you alone in the world without love. And through that fall into love, through the subjective process of becoming subject to love, which is happening to you, you become the true nature of your subjectivity. It's a dialectical negation of negation. It's an unfolding of your true self, which is a metaphor for love, which is a metaphor for Hegelian metaphysics, which is a metaphor for Žižek of communism and Marxism. That's how it all links up. It's a lot, but I hope that this tutorial has had a lot of things that make sense individually as well. If you're wondering about whether or not I record this, I in fact now have a microphone, brand new microphone, which I got for $20 on Target. And I am recording this as a podcast, which I will be posting to Patreon. On Patreon, you can download all of my tutorials as well as my ebook on Žižek and Lacan. And I'm going to type in the address real quick for you, and I would super appreciate it. You don't have to, but if you enjoyed this tutorial, I would super appreciate it if you decided to join the Patreon, even just for a little while, because that's how I can keep doing this. This is my absolute passion project. I love, love, love doing these lectures, these tutorials. So if you'd like to download these tutorials, if you'd like to access the bonus podcast, all that stuff, if you'd like to keep supporting me in this passion project of teaching theory and philosophy, please do go to www.patreon.com/Julian and Julian. Sign up at any tier. Any little bit makes a huge difference. It really, really does, because I love doing this so much, and I love doing it with you guys around the world. It is the best way to start my week. It is such an incredible blessing. And I really do, not to be schmaltzy, but I really do feel like education is love, because education is saying, I'm not asking to gain from you. I want to share with you, and I want us to mutually enrich and inspire each other. And that's the whole point of this tutorial on love. So thank you guys so much. Please do take a moment to look at www.patreon.com/Julian and Julian. Or if you don't have any funds that you can send my way, just sign up to the free newsletter. It costs nothing, and we can create a wonderful learning community together. All right, thank you guys so much. I will see you next week. I love you all, and I will see you on Monday. Or join me in 5 minutes for the bonus podcast. All right, bye guys. And on YouTube, thank you so much for watching. We kept it to 62 minutes, which seems good today. And I'm very much looking forward to next week. So thank you guys. I'm going to put the Patreon in the description for you. And for all the people who already support the Patreon, just a huge, huge, major thank you. It's such an incredible blessing. All right. Thanks, guys. See you next week.